Good evening, everyone. It's been a while. I thought I would return to all of you once more, all my oh so good friends. You seem to really be engaging with this content, and I love you for that. Um, so we continue onwards to chapter 13. Um, I do not have a clear recollection of what happened previously, but I assume as soon as we start reading, we'll catch back up. So let's go. Henry Foster loomed up through the twilight of the embryo store. Like to come to a feelie this evening? Lenina shook her head without speaking. Going out with someone else? It interested him to know which of his friends was being had by which other. Is it Benito? He questioned. She shook her head again. Henry detected the weariness in those purple eyes, the pallor beneath the dead gaze of lupus, the sadness at the corners of the unsmiling crimson mouth. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" he asked, a trifle anxiously, afraid that she might be suffering from one of the few remaining infectious diseases. Yet once more Lenina shook her head. "Anyhow, you ought to go and see the doctor," said Henry. "A doctor a day keeps the jim-jams away," he added heartily, driving home his hypnopedic adage with a clap on the shoulder. "Perhaps you need a pregnancy substitute," he suggested, "or else an extra-long VPS treatment. Sometimes, you know, the standard patient surrogate isn't quite—" "Oh, for God's sake," said Lenina, breaking her stubborn silence. "Shut up!" And she turned back to her neglected embryos. AVPS treatment indeed. She would have laughed if she hadn't been on the point of crying, as though she hadn't got enough VP on her own. She sighed profoundly as she refilled her syringe. "John," she murmured to herself, "John." Then, "My Ford," she wondered. "Have I given this one its sleeping sickness injection, or haven't I?" She simply couldn't remember. In the end, she decided not to run the risk of letting it have a second dose and moved down the line to the next bottle. 22 years, 8 months and 4 days from that moment, a promising young Alpha Minus administrator at Mwanza was to die of trypanosomiasis, the first case for over half a century. Sighing, Lenina went on with her work. An hour later, in the changing room, Fanny was energetically protesting. "But it's absurd to let yourself get into a state like this. Simply absurd," she repeated. "And what about a man? One man? But he's the one I want. As though there weren't millions of other men in the world. But I don't want them. How can you know till you've tried?" "I have tried. But how many?" asked Fanny, shrugging her shoulders contemptuously. "1? 2? Dozens. But," shaking her head, "it wasn't any good," she added. "Well, you must persevere," said Fanny sententiously. But it was obvious that her confidence in her own prescriptions had been shaken. Nothing can be achieved without perseverance. But meanwhile, don't think of him. I can't help it. Take Soma then. I do. Well, go on. But in the intervals, I still like him. I shall always like him. "Well, if that's the case," said Fanny with decision, "why don't you just go and take him, whether he wants it or no? But if you knew how terribly queer he was, all the more reason for taking a firm line. It's all very well to say that. Don't stand any nonsense. Act." Fanny's voice was a trumpet. She might have been a YWFA lecturer giving an evening talk to adolescent beta minuses. "Yes, act at once. Do it now." "I'd be scared," said Lenina. "Well, You've only got to take half a gram of soma first, and now I'm going to have my bath. She marched off, trailing her towel. The bell rang, and the savage, who was impatiently hoping that Helmholtz would come that afternoon, for having at last made up his mind to talk to Helmholtz about Lenina, he could not bear to postpone his confidences a moment longer, jumped up and ran to the door. "I had a premonition it was you, Helmholtz," he shouted as he opened. On the threshold in a white acetate satin sailor suit, and with a round white cap rakishly tilted over her left ear, stood Lenina. "Oh," said the savage, as though someone had struck him a heavy blow. Half a gram had been enough to make Lenina forget her fears and her embarrassments. "Hallo, John," she said, smiling, and walked past him into the room. Automatically he closed the door and followed her. Lenina sat down. There was a long silence. "You don't seem very glad to see me, John," she said at last. "Not glad?" The savage looked at her reproachfully, then suddenly fell on his knees before her and taking Lenina's hand, reverently kissed it. "Not glad? Oh, if you only knew," he whispered, and venturing to raise his eyes to her face. "Admired Lenina," he went on. "Indeed, the top of admiration. Worth what's dearest in the world." She smiled at him with a luscious tenderness. "Oh, you so perfect." She was leaning towards him with parted lips. "So perfect and so peerless are created. Nearer and nearer, of every creature's best, still nearer." The savage suddenly scrambled to his feet. "That's why," he said, speaking with averted face, "I wanted to do something first. I mean, to show I was worthy of you. Not that I could ever really be that. But at any rate, to show I wasn't absolutely unworthy. I wanted to do something." "Why shouldn't you think it necessary?" Lenina began, but left the sentence unfinished. There was a note of irritation in her voice when one has leaned forward, nearer and nearer with parted lips, only to find oneself quite suddenly, as a clumsy oaf scrambles to his feet, leaning towards nothing at all. Well, there is a reason. Even with half a gram of soma circulating in one's bloodstream, a genuine reason for annoyance. "At Malface," the savage was incoherently mumbling, "you had to bring her the skin of a mountain lion. I mean, when you wanted to marry someone, or else a wolf." "There aren't any lions in England," Lenina almost snapped. "And even if there were," the savage added, with sudden contemptuous resentment, "the people would kill them out of helicopters, I suppose, with poison gas or something. I wouldn't do that, Lenina." He squared his shoulders. He ventured to look at her, one was met with a stare of annoyed incomprehension. Confused, "I'll do anything," he went on, more and more incoherently. "Anything you tell me. There be some sports are painful, you know, but the labor delights in them sets off. That's what I feel. I mean, I'd sweep the floor if you wanted." Give me a sec. I need to get a sip of coffee. "I wouldn't do that, Lenina." He squared his shoulders. He ventured to look at her, and was met with a stare of annoyed incomprehension, confused. "I'll do anything," he went on, more and more incoherently. "Anything you tell me. There be some sports are painful, you know, but the labor delights in them sets off. That's what I feel. I mean, I'd sweep the floor if you wanted." "But we've got a vacuum cleaners here," said Lenina in bewilderment. "It isn't necessary." "No, of course it isn't necessary, but some kinds of baseness are nobly undergone. I'd like to undergo something nobly, don't you see? But if there are vacuum cleaners, that's not the point. And epsilon semi-morons to work them, she went on. Well, really why? Why, but for you. For you. Just to show that and what on earth vacuum cleaners have got to do with lions? To show how much, or lions with being glad to see me? She was getting more and more exasperated. How much I love you, Lenina, he brought out almost desperately. An emblem of the inner tide of strangled elation, the blood rushed into Lenina's cheeks. Do you mean it, John? But I hadn't meant to say so, cried the savage, clasping his hands in a kind of agony. Not until... Listen, Lenina, in Malface, people get married. Get what? The irritation had begun to creep back into her voice. What was he talking about now? For always. They make a promise to live together for always. What a horrible idea. Lenina was genuinely shocked. Outliving beauty outward with a mind that doth renew swifter than blood decays. What? It's like that in Shakespeare too. If thou dost break her virgin not, before all sanctimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite. For thought's sake, John, talk sense. I can't understand a word you say. First it's vacuum cleaners, then it's knots. You're driving me crazy. She jumped up and as though afraid that he might run away from her physically, as well as with his mind, caught him by the wrist. Answer me this question. Do you really like me, or don't you? There was a moment of silence. Then, in a very low voice, I love you more than anything in the world, he said. Then why on earth didn't you say so? She cried. And so intense was her exasperation that she drove her sharp nails into the skin of his wrist. Instead of drivelling away about knots and vacuum cleaners and lions and making me miserable for weeks and weeks, she released his hands and flung it angrily away from her. If I didn't like you so much, she said, I'd be furious with you. And suddenly her arms were round his neck. He felt her lips soft against his own, so deliciously soft, so warm and electric, that inevitably he found himself thinking of the embraces in 3 weeks in a helicopter. Ooh, ooh, the stereoscopic blonde and the more than real black amour. Horror, horror, horror. He tired to disengage himself. But Lenina tightened her embrace. Why didn't you say so? She whispered, drawing back her face to look at him. Her eyes were tenderly reproachful. The murkiest den, the most opportune place. The voice of a conscience thundered poetically. The strongest suggestion or worse a genius can shall never melt mine honour into lust. Never, never, he resolved. You silly boy, she was saying. I wanted you so much, and if you wanted me too, why didn't you? But Lenina, he began protesting. And as she immediately untwined her hands, as she stepped away from him, he thought for a moment that she had taken his unspoken hint, but when she unbuckled her white patent cartridge belt and hung it carefully over the back of a chair, he began to suspect that he had been mistaken. Lenina, he repeated apprehensively. She put her hand to her neck and gave a long vertical pull. Her white sailor's blouse was ripped to the hem. Suspicion condensed into a too solid certainty. Lenina, what are you doing? Zip, zip. Her answer was wordless. She stepped out of her bell-bottomed trousers. Her zippy kamikniks were a pale shell pink. The arch community songster's golden tea dangled at her breast. For those milk paps that through the window bars bore at men's eyes, the singing, thundering, magical words made her seem doubly dangerous, doubly alluring, soft, but how piercing, boring and drilling into reason, tunneling through resolution, the strongest oaths are straws to the fire in blood. Be more abstemious or else. Zip. The rounded pinkness fell apart like a neatly divided apple. A wriggle of the arms, a lifting first of the right foot and then the left. The Zippike micmacs were lying lifeless, and as though deflated on the ground, still wearing her shoes and socks, and her rakishly tilted round white cap. She advanced towards him. "Darling, darling, if only you'd said so before." She held out her hands, but instead of also saying "darling," and holding out his hands, the savage retreated in terror, flapping his hands at her as though he were trying to scare away some intruding and dangerous animal. 4 backward steps, and he was brought to bay against the wall. "Sweet," said Lenina, and, laying her hands on his shoulders, pressed herself against him. "Put your arms around me," she commanded. "Hug me till you drug me, honey." She too had poetry at her command, knew words that sang and were spells that beat drums. "Kiss me." She closed her eyes. She let her voice sink to a sleepy murmur. "Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snugly." The savage caught her by the wrists, tore her hands from his shoulders, thrust her roughly away at arm's length. "Ow, you're hurting me. Oh!" She was suddenly silent. Terror had made her forget the pain. Opening her eyes, she had seen his face. No, not his face. A ferocious stranger's, pale, distorted, twitching with some insane, inexplicable fury. Aghast. "But what is it, John?" she whispered. He did not answer, but only stared into her face with those mad eyes. The hands that held her wrists were trembling. He breathed deeply and irregularly, faint almost to imperceptibility, but appalling. She suddenly heard the grinding of his teeth. "What is it?" she almost screamed, and as though awakened by her cry, he caught her by the shoulders and shook her. "Whore!" he shouted. "Whore! Impudent strumpet!" "Oh, don't! Don't!" she protested in a voice made grotesquely tremulous by his shaking. "Whore! Please! Damned whore!" "A gram is better," she began. The savage pushed her away with such force that she staggered and fell. "Go," he shouted, standing over her menacingly. "Get out of my sight, or I'll kill you." He clenched his fists. Lenina raised her arm to cover her face. "No, please don't, John!" "Hurry up, quick!" One arm still raised and following his every movement, with a terrified eye, she scrambled to her feet and, still crouching, still covering her head, made a dash for the bathroom. The noise of that prodigious slap by which her departure was accelerated was like a pistol shot. "Ow!" Lenina bounded forward. Safely locked into the bathroom, she had leisure to take stock of her injuries. Standing with her back to the mirror, she twisted her head. Looking over her left shoulder, she could see the imprint of an open hand standing out distinct and crimson on the pearly flesh. Gingerly she rubbed the wounded spot. Outside, in the other room, the savage was striding up and down, marching to the drums and music of magical words. The wren ghost totted to it, and the small gilded fly does ledger in my sight. Meddlingly they rumbled in his ears. "The fit you, nor the soiled horse, goes toeth with a more righteous appetite. Down from the waist they are centaurs, though women all above. But to the girdle do the gods inherit. Beneath is all the fiends. There's the hell. There's darkness. There is the sulphurous pit, burning, scalding stench. consumption, fie, 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 pah, pah, give me an ounce of civet, good apothecary, to sweeten my imagination. John, ventured a small, ingratiating voice from the bathroom. John, O thou weed, who art so lovely fair, and smellst so sweet, that the sense aches at thee. What was this most goodly book made to write whore upon? Heaven stops the nose at it. But her perfume still hung about him. His jacket was white with the powder that had scented her velvety body. Impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet. The inexorable rhythm beat itself out. Impudent. John, do you think I might have my clothes? He zipped up the bell-bottom trousers, the blouse, the zippica micmacs. Open, he ordered, kicking the door. No, I won't. The voice was frightened and defiant. Well, how do you expect me to give them to you? Push them through the ventilator over the door. He did what she suggested and returned to his uneasy pacing of the room. Impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet. The devil luxury with his fat rump and potato finger. John, he would not answer. Fat rump and potato finger. John, what is it? He asked gruffly. I wonder if you'd mind giving me my Malthusian belt, Nina said, listening to the footsteps in the other room, wondering, as she listened, how long he was likely to go tramping up and down like that, whether she would have to wait until he left the flat, or if it would be safe, after allowing his madness a reasonable time to subside, to open a bathroom door and make a dash for it. She was interrupted in the midst of these uneasy speculations by the sound of the telephone ringing in the other room. Abruptly the tramping ceased. She heard the voice of the savage parleying with silence. Hello? Yes? If I do not usurp myself, I am. Yes, didn't you hear me say so? Mr. Savage speaking. What? Who's ill? Of course it interests me. But, is it serious? Is she really bad? I'll go at once. Not in her rooms anymore. Where has she been taken? Oh my God. What's the address? 3 Park Lane. Is that it? 3? Thanks. Lenina heard the click of the replaced receiver, then hurrying steps. The door slammed. There was silence. Was he really gone? With an infinity of precautions, she opened the door a quarter of an inch, peeped through the crack, was encouraged by the view of emptiness, opened a little further, and put her whole head out. Finally tiptoed into the room, stood for a few seconds with a strongly beating heart, listening, then darted to the front door, opened, slipped through, slammed, ran. It was not till she was in the lift and actually dropping down a well that she began to feel herself secure. Okay, we're gonna go in chapter 14 next. Gonna take another sip. It's surprisingly tiring to actually read for such a long amount of time, but it's really fun to do. Or at least I think it's fun to do. I assume quite a few people don't find it interesting. The Park Lane Hospital for the Dying was a 60-story tower of primrose tiles. As the savage stepped out of his taxicopter, a convoy of gaily colored aerial hearses rose whirring from the roof and darted away across the park, westward, bound for the slow crematorium. At the lift gates, the presiding porter gave him the information he required, and he dropped down to Ward 81, a galloping senility ward, the porter explained. On the 17th floor, it was a large room bright with sunshine and yellow paint, containing 20 beds, all occupied. Linda was dying in company, and with all the modern conveniences. The air was continuously alive with gay, synthetic melodies. At the foot of her bed, confronting its moribund occupant, was a television box. Television was left on, a running tap, from morning till night. Every quarter of an hour, the prevailing perfume of the room was automatically changed. "We try," explained the nurse, who had taken charge of the savage at the door, "we try to create a thoroughly pleasant atmosphere here. Something between a first-class hotel and a feely palace, if you take my meaning." "Where is she?" asked the savage, ignoring these polite explanations. The nurse was offended. "You are in a hurry," she said. "Is there any hope?" he asked. "You mean of her not dying?" He nodded. "No, of course there isn't. When somebody's sent here, there's no—" Startled by the expression of distress on his pale face, she suddenly broke off. "Why, whatever is the matter?" she asked. She was not accustomed to this kind of thing in visitors. Not that there were many visitors anyhow, or any reason why there should be many visitors. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" He shook his head. "She's my mother," he said in a scarcely audible voice. The nurse glanced at him with startled, horrified eyes, then quickly looked away. From throat to temple she was all one hot blush. "Take me to her," she said the savage, making an effort to speak in an ordinary tone. Still blushing, she led the way down the ward, faces still fresh and unwithered, for senility galloped so hard that it had no time to age the cheeks, only the heart, and that it had and brain. Turned as they passed, their progress was followed by the blank, incurious eyes of second infancy. The savage shuddered as he looked. Linda was lying in the last of the long row of beds, next to the wall. Propped up on the pillows, she was watching the semi-finals of the South American Riemann Service Tennis Championship, which were being played in silent and diminished reproduction on the screen of the television box at the foot of the bed. Hither and thither, across the square of illuminated glass, the little figures noiselessly darted like fish in an aquarium. The silent but agitated inhabitants of another world. Linda looked on, vaguely and incomprehendingly smiling. Her pale, bloated face wore an expression of imbecile happiness. Every now and then her eyelids closed, and for a few seconds she seemed to be dozing. Then, with a little start, she would wake up again, wake up to the aquarium antics of the tennis champions, to the super vox Wurlitzerzeria rendering of "Hug me till you drug me, honey," to the warm draught of verbena that came blowing through the ventilator above her head, would wake to those things, or rather to a dream of which these things, transformed and embellished by the soma in her blood, were marvelous constituents, and smile once more her broken and discolored smile of infantile contentment. "Well, I must go," said the nurse. "I've got my batch of children coming. Besides, there's number 3. She pointed up the ward. "Might go off any minute now. Well, make yourself comfortable." She walked briskly away. The savage sat down beside the bed. "Linda," he whispered, taking her hand. At the sound of her name she turned. Her vague eyes brightened with recognition. She squeezed his hand. She smiled. Her lips moved. Then quite suddenly her head fell forward. She was asleep. He sat watching her, seeking through the tired flesh, seeking and finding that young and bright face which had stooped over his childhood in Malface, remembering, and he closed his eyes, her voice, her movements, all the events of their life together. Streptococcus to Banbury tea. how beautiful her singing had been, and those childish rhymes, how magically strange and mysterious. A, B, C, vitamin D, the fat's in the liver, and the cod's in the sea. He felt the hot tears welling up behind his eyelids as he recalled the words and Linda's voice as he repeated them. And then the reading lessons. The tot is in the pot, the cat is on the mat, and the elementary instructions for beta workers in the embryo store, and long evenings by the fire or in summertime on the roof of the little house. When she told him those stories about the other place, outside the reservation, that beautiful, beautiful other place, whose memory, as of a sky, a paradise of goodness and loveliness, he still kept whole and intact, undefiled by contact with the reality of this real London, these actual civilized men and women. A sudden noise of shrill voices made him open his eyes, and after hastily brushing away the tears, look round. What seemed an interminable stream of identical 8-year-old male twins was pouring into the room, twin after twin after twin after twin. They came a nightmare. Twin and a twin, they came a nightmare. Their faces, their repeated faces, for there was only one between the lot of them, puggishly stared, all nostrils and pale goggling eyes. Their uniform was khaki. All their mouths hung open, squealing and chattering they entered. In a moment, it seemed, the ward was maggoty with them. They swarmed between the beds, clambered over, crawled under, peeped into the television boxes, made faces at the patients. Linda, astonished and rather alarmed by them, a group stood clustered at the foot of her bed, staring with frightened and stupid curiosity of animals suddenly confronted by the unknown. "Oh, look! Look!" they spoke in low, scared voices. "Whatever is the matter with her? Why is she so fat?" They had never seen a face like hers before, had never seen a face that was not youthful and taut-skinned, a body that had ceased to be slim and upright. All these moribund sexagenarians had the appearance of childish girls. At 44, Linda seemed, by contrast, a monster of flaccid and distorted senility. "Isn't she awful?" came the whispered comments. "Look at her teeth!" Suddenly, from under the bed, a pug-faced twin popped up between John's chair and the wall, and began peering into Linda's sleeping face. "I say," he began, but the sentence ended prematurely in a squeal. The savage had seized him by the collar, lifted him clear over the chair, and with a smart box on the ears, sent him howling away. His yell brought the head nurse hurrying to the rescue. "What have you been doing to him?" she demanded fiercely. "I won't have you striking the children." "Well then, keep them away from this bed." The savage's voice was trembling with indignation. "What are these filthy little brats doing here at all? It's disgraceful." "Disgraceful? What do you mean?" "They're being deaf-conditioned. And I tell you," she warned him truculently, "if I have any more of your interference with their conditioning, I'll send for the porters and have you thrown out." The savage rose to his feet and took a couple of steps towards her. His movement and the expression on his face was so menacing that the nurse fell back in terror. With a great effort he checked himself and, without speaking, turned away and sat down again by the bed, reassured but with a dignity that was a trifle shrill and uncertain. "I've warned you," said the nurse, "so mind." Still, she led the two inquisitive twins away and made them join in the game of Hunt the Zipper, which had been organized by one of her colleagues at the other end of the room. "Run along now, and have your cup of caffeine solution, dear," she said to the other nurse. The exercise of authority restored her confidence, made her feel better. "Now, children," she called. Linda had stirred uneasily. had opened her eyes for a moment, looked vaguely around, and then once more dropped off to sleep. Sitting beside her, the savage tried hard to recapture his mood of a few minutes before. A, B, C, vitamin D, he repeated to himself, as though the words were a spell that would restore the dead past to life. But the spell was ineffective. Obstinately, the beautiful memories refused to rise. There was only a hateful resurrection of jealousies and ugliness and miseries. Popeye with the blood trickling down from his cut shoulder, and Linda hideously asleep. And the flies buzzing round the split mescal on the floor beside the bed, and the boys calling those names as she passed. Ah, no, no! He shut his eyes. He shook his head in strenuous denial of these memories. A, B, C, vitamin D. He tried to think of those times when he sat on her knees and she put her arms around him and sank, over and over again, rocking him to sleep. A, B, C, vitamin D, vitamin D, vitamin D. The super fox Wurlitzer had risen to a sobbing crescendo, and suddenly the verbena gave place, in the scent circulating system, to an intense patchouli. Linda stirred, woke up, stared for a few seconds bewilderingly at the semi-finalists, then, lifting her face, sniffed once or twice at the newly perfumed air, and suddenly smiled. A smile of childish ecstasy. "Popeye!" she murmured, and closed her eyes. "Oh, I do so like it. I do," she sighed, and let herself sink back into the pillows. "But Linda," the savage spoke imploringly, "don't you know me?" He had tried so hard, had done his very best. Why wouldn't she allow him to forget? He squeezed her limp hand almost with violence, as though he would force her to come back from this dream of ignoble pleasures, from these base and hateful memories, back into the present, back into reality. The appalling present, the awful reality, but sublime, but significant, but desperately important precisely because of the immense of that which made them so fearful. "Don't you know me, Linda?" He felt the faint answering presence of her hand. The tears started into his eyes. He bent over her and kissed her. Her lips moved. "Popeye," she whispered again, and it was as though he had had a pailful of ordure thrown in his face. Anger suddenly boiled up in him, barked for a second time. The passion of his grief had found another outlet, was transformed to a passion of agonized rage. "But I'm John," he shouted. "I'm John!" And in his furious misery he actually caught her by the shoulder and shook her. Linda's eyes fluttered open. She saw him, knew him, John, but situated the real face, the real and violent hands, in an imaginary world, among the inward and private equivalents of patchouli and the super Wurlitzer, among the transfigured memories and the strangely transposed sensations that constituted the universe of her dream. She knew him for John, her son, but fancied him an intruder into that paradise on Malface, where she had been spending her summer holiday with Popeye. He was angry, because she liked Popeye. He was shaking her because Popeye was there in the bed, as though there was something wrong, as though all civilized people didn't do the same. Everyone belongs to every. Her voice suddenly died into an almost inaudible, breathless croaking. Her mouth fell open. She made a desperate effort to fill her lungs with air, but it was as though she had forgotten how to breathe. She tried to cry out, but no sound came. Only the terror of her staring eyes revealed what she was suffering. Her hand went to her throat, then clawed at the air she could no longer breathe, the air that, for her, had ceased to exist. The savage was on his feet, bent over her. "What is it? Linda, what is it?" His voice was imploring. It was though he were begging to be reassured. The look she gave him was charged with an unspeakable terror, with terror and, it seemed to him, reproach. She tried to raise herself in bed, but fell back on her pillows. Her face was horridly distorted, her lips blue. The savage turned and ran up the ward. "Quick! Quick!" he shouted. "Quick!" Standing in the center of a ring of zipper-hunting twins, the head nurse looked round. The first moment's astonishment gave place almost instantly to disapproval. "Don't shout! Think of the little ones," she said, frowning. "You might decondition." "But what are you doing?" He had broken through the ring. "Be careful," a child was yelling. "Quick, quick!" He caught her by the sleeve, dragged her after him. "Quick! Something's happening! I've killed her!" By the time they were back at the end of the ward, Linda was dead. The savage stood for a moment in frozen silence, then fell on his knees beside the bed, and, covering his face with his hands, sobbed uncontrollably. The nurse stood irresolute, looking now at the kneeling figure by the bed, the scandalous exhibition, and now, poor children, at the twins who had stopped their hunting of the zipper and were staring from the other end of the ward, staring with all their eyes and nostrils at the shocking scene that was being enacted round bed 20. Should she speak to him, try to bring him back to a sense of decency, remind him of where he was, of what fatal mischief he might do to these poor innocents, undoing all their wholesome death conditioning with this disgusting outcry, as though death was something terrible, as though anyone mattered as much as all that. It might give them the most disastrous ideas about the subject, might upset them into reacting in the whole entirely wrong, the utterly anti-social way. She stepped forward. She touched him on the shoulder. "Can't you behave?" she said in a low, angry voice, but looking around, she saw that half a dozen twins were already on their feet and advancing down the ward. The circle was disintegrating. In another moment, no, the risk was too great. The whole group might be put back 6 or 7 months in its conditioning. She hurried back towards her menaced charges. "Now, who wants a chocolate eclair?" she asked, in a loud, cheerful tone. "Me!" yelled the entire Bokanovsky group in chorus. Bed 20 was completely forgotten. "Oh, God, God, God," the savage kept repeating to himself. In the chaos of grief and remorse that filled his mind, it was the one articulate word. "God," he whispered it aloud. "God." "Whatever is he saying?" said a voice, very near, distinct and shrill through the warblings of the Superwulitzer. The savage finally started, and uncovering his face, looked round. 5 khaki twins, each with the stump of a long eclair in his right hand, and their identical faces, variously smeared with liquid chocolate, were standing in a row, pudgily goggling at him. They met his eyes and simultaneously grinned. One of them pointed with his eclair butt. "Is she dead?" he asked. The savage stared at them for a moment in silence. Then, in silence, he rose to his feet. In silence, slowly walked towards the door. "Is she dead?" repeated the inquisitive twin, trotting at his side. The savage looked down at him, and still without speaking, pushed him away. The twin fell on the floor, and at once began to howl. The savage did not even look round. The menial staff of the Park Lane Hospital for the Dying consisted of 162 deltas, divided into 2 Bokanovsky groups of 84 red-headed female and 78 dark dolichocephalic male twins, respectively at 6. When their working day was over, the 2 groups assembled in the vestibule of the hospital, and was served by the deputy sub-bursar with their soma ration. From the lift, the savage stepped out into the midst of them, but his mind was elsewhere, with death, with his grief and his remorse. Mechanically, without consciousness of what he was doing, he began to shoulder his way through the crowd. "Who are you pushing? Where do you think you're going?" High, low, from a multitude of separate throats, only two voices squeaked or growled, repeated indefinitely, as though by a train of mirrors. Two faces, one a hairless and freckled moon haloed in orange, the other a thin, beaked bird mask, stubbly with 2 days' beard, turned angrily towards him. Their words, and in his ribs, the sharp nudging of elbows, broke through his unawareness. He woke once more to external reality, looked round him, knew what he saw, knew it, with a sinking sense of horror and disgust, for the recurrent delirium of his days and nights, the nightmare of swarming in distinguishable sameness, twins, like maggots they had swarmed defilingly over this mystery of Linda's death, maggots again, but larger, fully grown. They now crawled across his grief and his repentance. He halted, and with bewildered and horrified eyes, stared round him at the khaki mob, in the midst of which, overtopping it by a full head, he stood. "How many goodly creatures are there here?" the singing words mocked him derisively. "How beauteous mankind is! O brave new world!" "Soma distribution," shouted a loud voice. "In good order, please. Hurry up there." A door had been opened, a table and chair carried into the vestibule. The voice that of a jaunty young alpha, who had entered carrying a black iron cash box. A murmur of satisfaction went up from the expectant twins. They forgot all about the savage. Their attention was now focused on the black cash box, which the young man had placed on the table, and was now in the process of unlocking. The lid was lifted. "Ooh," said all the 162 simultaneously, as though they were looking at fireworks. The young man took out a handful of tiny pill boxes. "Now," he said peremptorily, "step forward, please. One at a time and no shoving." One at a time, with no shoving, the twins stepped forward. First 2 males, then a female, then another male, then 3 females. Then the savage stood looking. "Oh, brave new world! Oh, brave new world!" In his mind the singing words seemed to change their tone. They had mocked him through his misery and remorse. Mocked him how hideous, a note of cynical derision. Fiendishly laughing, they had insisted on the low squalor, the nauseous ugliness of the nightmare. Now suddenly they trumpeted a call to arms. "Oh, brave new world!" Miranda was proclaiming this possibility of loveliness, the possibility of transforming even the nightmare into something fine and noble. Oh, brave new world! It was a challenge, a command. "No shoving there now!" shouted the deputy sub-bursar in a fury. He slammed down the lid of his cash box. "I shall stop the distribution unless I have a good behavior." The deltas murmured, jostled one another a little, and then were still. The threat had been effective. Deprivation of soma. Appalling thought. "That's better," said the young man, and reopened his cash box. Linda had been a slave. Linda had died. Others should live in freedom, and the world be made beautiful. A repatriation. A reparation. A duty. And suddenly it was luminously clear to the savage what he must do. It was as though a shutter had been opened, a curtain drawn back. "Now," said the deputy sub-bursar, another khaki female stepped forward. "Stop!" called the savage in a loud and ringing voice. "Stop!" He pulled his way to the table. The delta stared at him with astonishment. "Forward!" said the deputy sub-bursar below his breath. It's the savage. He felt scared. Listen, I beg of you, cried the savage earnestly. Lend me your ears. He had never spoken in public before, and found it very difficult to express what he wanted to say. Don't take that horrible stuff. It's poison. It's poison. I say, Mr. Savage, said the deputy sub-bursar, smiling providentially, would you mind letting me? Poison to soul as well as body? Yes, but let me get on with my distribution, won't you? There's a good fellow. With the cautious tenderness of one who strokes a notoriously vicious animal, he patted the savage arm. Just let me— Never! Cried the savage. But look here, old man. Throw it all away. That horrible poison. The words, throw it all away, pierced through the enfolding layers of incomprehension to the quick of the Delta's consciousness. An angry murmur went up from the crowds. I come to bring you freedom, said the savage, turning back towards the twins. I come— The deputy sub-bursar heard no more. He had slipped out of the vestibule, and was looking up a number in the telephone book. Not in his own words, Bernard summed up. Not in mine. Not in yours. Not at the Aphroditeum. Not at the center of the college. Where can he have got to? Helmholtz shrugged his shoulders. They had come back from their work, expecting to find the savage waiting for them at one or other of the usual meeting places, and there was no sign of the fellow, which was annoying, as they had meant to nip across to Biarritz in Helmholtz's four-seater sportacopter. They'd be late for dinner if he didn't come soon. We'll give him 5 more minutes, said Helmholtz. If he doesn't turn up by then, we'll— The ringing of the telephone bell interrupted him. He picked up the receiver. Hello, speaking. Then, after a long interval of listening, Ford and Flyver, he swore. I'll come at once. What is it? Bernard asked. A fellow I know at the Park Lane Hospital, said Helmholtz. The savage is there. Seem to have gone mad, anyhow. It's urgent. Will you come with me? Together they hurried along the corridor to the lifts. But do you like being slaves? The savage was saying as they entered the hospital. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with ardor and indignation. Do you like being babies? Yes, babies, mewling and puking, he added, exasperated by their bestial stupidity, into throwing insults at those he had come to save. The insults bounced off their carapace of thick stupidity. They stared at him with a blank expression of dull and sullen resentment in their eyes. Yes, puking, he fairly shouted. Grief and remorse, compassion and duty, all were forgotten now, as it were, absorbed into an intense, overpowering hatred of these less than human monsters. Don't you want to be free and men? Don't you even understand what manhood and freedom are? Rage was making him fluent. The words came easily in a rush. Don't you? He repeated, but got no answer to his question. Very well then, he went on grimly. I'll teach you. I will make you be free whether you want to or not. And pushing open a window that looked onto the inner court of the hospital, he began to throw the little pill boxes of Soma tablets in handfuls out into the area. For a moment the khaki mob was silent, petrified at the spectacle of this wanton sacrilege, what with amazement and horror. He's mad, whispered Bernard, staring with wide-open eyes. They'll kill him. They'll— A great shout suddenly went up from the mob. A wave of movement drove it menacingly towards the savage. Ford help him, said Bernard, and averted his eyes. Ford help those who help themselves. And with a laugh, actually a laugh of exultation, Helmholtz Watson pushed his way through the crowd. Free! Free! The savage shouted, and with one hand continued to throw the Soma into the area while, with the other, he punched the indistinguishable faces of his assailants. Free! And suddenly there was Helmholtz at his side. Good old Helmholtz, also punching. Men at last! And in the interval also throwing the poison out by handfuls through the open window. Yes, men! Men! And there was no more poison left. He picked up the cash box and showed them its black emptiness. You're free! Howling, the Deltas charged with a redoubled fury. Hesitant on the fringes of the battle, they're done for, said Bernard, and urged by a sudden impulse, ran forward to help them. Then thought better of it and halted. Then, ashamed, stepped forward again. Then again thought better of it, and was standing in an agony of humiliated indecision, thinking that they might be killed if he didn't help them, and that he might be killed if he did, when, Ford be praised, goggle-eyed and swine-snouted in their gas mask, in ran the police. Bernard dashed to meet them. He waved his arms and it was action. He was doing something. He shouted help several times, more and more loudly so as to give himself the illusion of helping. Help! 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 The policemen pushed him out of the way and got on with their work. 3 men with spraying machines, buckled to their shoulders, pumped thick clouds of soma vapor into the air. 2 more were busy round the portable synthetic music box, carrying water pistols charged with a powerful anesthetic. 4 others had pushed their way into the crowd and were methodically laying out, squirt by squirt, the more ferocious of the fighters. Quick, yelled Bernard. They'll be killed if you don't hurry. Oh! Annoyed by his chatter, one of the policemen had given him a shot from his water pistol. Bernard stood for a second or two, wobbling unsteadily on legs that seemed to have lost their bones, their tendons, their muscles, to have become mere sticks of jelly, and at last not even jelly, or water. He tumbled into a heap on the floor. Suddenly, from out of the synthetic music box a voice began to speak, the voice of reason, the voice of good feeling. The soundtrack roll was unwinding itself in synthetic anti-riot speech number 2, medium strength, straight from the depths of a non-existent heart. My friends, said the voice so pathetically, with a note of such infinitely tender reproach that behind their gas masks, even the policeman's eyes were momentarily dimmed with tears. What is the meaning of this? Why aren't you all being happy and good together? Happy and good, the voice repeated. At peace, at peace. It trembled, sank into a whisper, and momentarily expired. Oh, I do want you to be happy, it began, with a yearning earnestness. I do so want you to be good. Please be good. And 2 minutes later the voice and the soma vapor had produced their effect. In tears the Deltas were kissing and hugging one another, 6 twins at a time in a comprehensive embrace. Even Helmholtz and the Savage were almost crying. A fresh supply of pillboxes was brought in from the bursary. A new distribution was hastily made, and to the sound of the voice, richly affectionate, baritone valedictions, the twins dispersed, blubbering as though their hearts would break. Goodbye, my dearest friends. Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest friends. Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest. When the last of the Deltas had gone, the policeman switched off the current. The angelic voice fell silent. Will you come quietly? Asked the sergeant, or must we anesthetize? He pointed his water pistol menacingly. All will come quietly, the Savage answered, dabbing alternately a cut lip, a scratched neck, and a bitten left hand. Still keeping his handkerchief to his bleeding nose, Helmholtz nodded in confirmation. Awake, and having recovered the use of his legs, Bernard had chosen this moment to move as inconspicuously as he could towards the door. Hi, you there, called the sergeant, and a swine-masked policeman hurried across the room and laid a hand on the young man's shoulder. Bernard turned with an expression of indignant innocence. Escaping? He hadn't dreamed of such a thing. Though what on earth you want me for, he said to the sergeant, I really can't imagine. you're a friend of the prisoners, aren't you?" "Well," said Bernard, and hesitated. No, he really couldn't deny it. Why shouldn't I be?" he asked. "Come on then," said the sergeant, and led the way towards the door and the waiting police car. That was chapter 16. I mean, it's good to be back. I actually do really like reading out loud. It's nice to do, especially once you get into the groove. Like when the savage was angry at the crowd. Like actually reading it out loud makes you go through the emotions yourself. So that's nice. But just like the police shut off the angelic voice, I'll be shutting off my own angelic voice now. I want to thank all my loyal viewers for watching this broadcast once more. I know some of you will be watching this video over and over again because it's so amazing. You are, of course, allowed to do this, so... But other than that, I would like to wish you all a fine evening, and I will see you guys next time.